Well, hello. We are reading through the book of Galatians together, and today we're reading chapter 2, verses 1 through to 10. The letter of Galatians is a letter about the gospel. The Apostle Paul is writing to Christians in Galatia, and indeed to you and I today, to remind us of the message of the gospel. And for Paul, this message was about freedom. The good news is about freedom. Paul says that to be loved, accepted, saved, rescued, redeemed, restored by God, we do not need to do anything except believe. We don't need to behave. We don't need to clean ourselves up. We don't need to perform lots of rituals and follow loads of rules to be accepted and redeemed and saved by God. All we got to do is believe. It's freedom. But in the church in Galatia, some false teachers had infiltrated, and they began to teach that in order to be accepted by God, yeah, we needed to believe in Jesus, but there were also some other things that God required as well, such as following certain food laws, such as the men being circumcised, and several other things as well. And so this message about freedom and free grace had been turned into a message about slavery. And Paul is writing to correct this false teaching. Listen to what he says in verse 2, verses 1 to 10. After 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery. To them we did not yield in submission, even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. Paul's message was one of freedom, but these false teachers were turning the message into something that brought slavery rather than freedom. And this letter is Paul's attempt to remind and to defend and to fight for the freedom that the gospel promotes. I'm reminded when I read this passage of that old film Braveheart. You've probably seen it, some of you, but it's a film about a Scottish knight called William Wallace, who fought probably about 1,000 years ago. I'm not exactly sure when it was, but he fought to preserve the freedom of the Scottish people, to protect them from becoming slaves to the English. He fought for himself because he didn't want to become a slave. He fought for his people at the time, but his fight was also for the succeeding generations. He didn't want them to be slaves to the English. And you've all seen, I'm sure, the famous scene at the end of the film where he says to the armies that are gathered, let's fight for freedom. Essentially, he says, freedom. They may take our lives, he said, but they'll never take our freedom. To William Wallace. That's what Paul is doing here. He's saying the gospel is about freedom. And I will not yield to these false brothers for a second, because all they want to do is to draw you back into slavery. But the gospel is about freedom. Now, it's really easy for us to drift back into slavery. And I think this message that Paul delivers to us is one that we need to continually be revisiting. Freedom. You're free today. We're free because of the gospel. Just reflect on that, would you, for a few moments.